The last thing that we were looking at was the eighth, that the Antichrist, as far as his characteristics, he is the eighth in a series of 8 kings. Now the thing about that is that is important to understand, beside what we've already talked about, is just the fact that this is really putting out a series of a kind. And so this is not something in which thematically or characteristically these kings are different. There's something about them that's common to all of them. Because he says that there's 7 of them, 5 were, 1 is to come, and then an 8th is going to come. And he says that the 8th is one of the 7th. He is of the type of the 7 before him. So that little phrase there is the thing that really has helped me interpret this the way that I do, because it makes me understand that whatever these 8 kings are, they have something in common. And now there's a lot of interpreters who will say what they have in common is they're all emperors of the Roman Empire. The preterists like to do that. Others who interpret this try to do that. And it just doesn't fit. It doesn't work. It's not what it's about. What God's talking about is that there are 8 kings throughout time, throughout history, that have had this thing in common. And if you recall what I said last week, is I just glossed right over that, but it's an important thing, so I'm coming back and making sure that you get it, is that these are, the thing they have in common is these are 8 kings who have withstood the Abrahamic promise. And by their actions, they came this close to destroying the promise given to Abraham for Israel. Now that promise is basically twofold, right? That his people would be in his land. So you have Jews in the Holy Land, that's the promise. So these 8 kings are all going to do what they can to subvert that promise. Now ultimately the reason that gets done is the Antichrist wants to subvert the whole promise of the Messiah. But the subversion of Abraham's promise, if you look through if you remember, we went through those. Egypt, that goes without saying, right? We all understand if Egypt would have had their way, the Jews would have never been in the Holy Land. That was the promise of Abraham. So therefore, it was an effort to undermine that promise. Then we went to the Assyrians. The Assyrians came in to dispose of the Jews living in the Holy Land. Again, that's a subversion of the Abrahamic promise. Then we went to Babylon, same thing. Babylon tried to take the Israelites away and subvert the promise to Abraham. Then we came to the next kingdom, which was the Persians, and this is where we were talking about Esther, if you recall. And the problem there is not that the Persians were necessarily bad. Cyrus is the one who sent them back and gave them the right to rebuild the temple again. So it's not necessarily that all the Persian monarchs or everything about the Persian kingdom was dead set against them, but if you remember the Vizier Haman and his efforts to destroy the Jews, he wanted to kill them all. That would have been subverting the promise of Abraham. And then we go to, now this is the one I just skipped past this because I was trying to move on past things, but someone Chris, someone asked me, what was the 5th one? What was the 5th one? And I said, she said, was it Greece? I said, yeah, it's Greece. Specifically, it was the Seleucid Empire. Alexander, of course, was the first big Greek. He died young. When he died, there was no heir ready, and so his kingdom got divvied up amongst his top 7 generals, and they kind of jostled each other for about 20 years, and what settled out was 4 steady, solid kingdoms that were Greek in nature but were not in Greece. They were in all the realms that Alexander had conquered. One of those generals was a guy named Seleucus, and the realm that he was given was maybe the biggest one. He was given the area of, well, let's do this. Ha-ha! He was given Israel. this yellow realm. That is the Seleucid realm of Alexander's empire. Now, within like 5 years, most of this had either achieved its sovereignty and independence, or it was reduced to a very minor vassal state. So basically, the Seleucid Empire very quickly was only, up in this area. And from that time until the time of its end, it slowly diminished, slowly shrank back. Every now and again, it would take over Palestine. You can see there's a purple dot around that. That's because this kingdom down here, the Ptolemaic kingdom, they jostled back and forth. This would be the king of the south, if you're reading in Daniel, right? That was the Ptolemaic realm. They ruled out of Alexandria. And then you had the Seleucid realm. This was the king of the north. They ruled up north. They went back and forth over Palestine, over the Holy Land, throughout their times as kingdom for the most part. These other realms really don't enter into too much. I mean, other than that they fulfill what the scriptures teach us in Daniel 8 about, the four horns coming out of the Greek realm. So that's basically that. Now, the Seleucid realm was ruled by the headquarters here. Now it moved around a little bit. There was another capital city that was called Seleucus, but for the most part, right there where that dot is, that's Antioch, and that was their capital for the most part. And that realm, under one of their rulers, Antiochus IV. If you know about Hanukkah, this is where that particular tradition came from. But Antiochus did not like Judaism. He did not like the Jews. He did not like Jewish practice. He was dead set against it. He forbade circumcision. He burned the Torah, the scrolls of the Word of God. He ultimately went into the temple and he set up an idol of Zeus, which is a pretty bad thing to do to the temple, right? And he sacrificed a pig on the altar. I guess it goes without saying, is what I'm trying to say, I guess, is that got the Jews mad. And they rebelled under the Maccabees, particularly if you're reading like a Catholic Bible, or maybe you have a mainline Bible with the Apocrypha in it, and you have the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Maccabees, and it's all about this particular story that ultimately ends with Antiochus getting kicked out of Jerusalem, the temple, and Jerusalem being restored to the Jews. They purified the temple and were trying to get it back up to holiness after this desecration. And they needed oil, right, to keep the lamps in the temple, and it was a special recipe, and you could not make that recipe for anything but lighting the lamps in the temple. And they just, after all of this, they just didn't have enough. And so they had a little bit of oil, and they put it in the lamps, and they lit them up, and they lasted for 8 days until they were able to get more supply made. And so that little, miracle is what Hanukkah is all about. So long and short about that is that, there we go. That's that realm right there. That's the 5th one. Remember, it said in that text, 5 were, one is to come, and won't be around long, and then the 8th one will be the beast. Okay, so that's what that says in Revelation chapter 17. So, the Seleucid realm, under Antiochus Epiphanes, was 5 right here. The Seleucid realm disappeared. It was knocked out by a succession of Roman incursions into the area. Eventually, that kingdom was dissolved, and so it was, at the time that the Revelation was written, it was no more. Right? And that's very important to meet the text interpretively. Because, with the Roman emperor things, it's really hard to make an argument that you can fit something into that category and have it get you to the beast. You really can't. So anyhow, that's the Seleucid realm. The realm that was, when John was speaking, or being spoken to, was Rome. And the reason Rome fits this pattern is that under a succession of emperors, we could start with Vespasian, really. Vespasian and his son Titus, that's early, around 70 AD in the burning of the Second Temple. But then later on, Hadrian and Trajan also had very anti-Jewish policies. Ultimately, they kicked the Jews out of Jerusalem, and then they kicked the Jews out of the environs of Jerusalem, so out of the Holy Land. And that's where the diaspora comes from. Now, is that against the promise of Abraham? Yeah, because the promise that God made to Abraham was that Abraham's children, right, through Isaac and Jacob, Abraham's children would get that land. So you have very specific promises from Abraham. You can either kill the children or you can take the land away from them if you want to undermine that promise. And that's what all of these schemes, represented by these 8 kings, did. The one that was to come but wouldn't be around long, we went through the logic of that, right? Can you think of anything in the history since the Romans that had as a goal to do away with the Jews? It was a really easy thing. This is a very easy piece of history to read in terms of biblical prophecy. Well, right there it is. It's Nazi Germany. So the 7th king is Nazi Germany, Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany. That leads a couple questions, right? I mean, you have this wonderful number 7 there. 7 is a biblical number. Generally, it means something is complete, something is full. And I find it interesting that on this particular scheme, if this was trying to deal with something that had any connection to holiness, it would end with 7. Because that's the perfect number. But it didn't, right? It goes on to the 8th, and it calls out a specific 8th. Why? Well, this is trying to get us to understand the type, the thing that all of these realms have in common. What is it about them? They're just not happen to be kingdoms that rose and fell throughout history. They have something evil. Something evil and something that cannot be allowed to be perfected about them. And what that is they're all have this characteristic in common. And really, they have this characteristics in common in a way that really no other kingdoms do. This is the characteristic they have. They all were dead set, on undermining the Abrahamic promise. And so that takes you up to Nazi Germany. That leaves you with the 8th, right? Now, the 7th is not going to be around long. Hitler wasn't around long. All right, that was 12 years. And it says that the 8th one will come thereafter, soon. Now, Nazi Germany has been gone since, fully since May of 1945. So that means that, we're getting into a long stretch. There's some sense of maybe anticipation, maybe a sense of urgency that might, be called for just by, that particular factor. That's that, and so I'll move on to this. We're looking again at the characteristics, what can we say that we know about this figure, the Antichrist? He will be the king of the north. This is made very clear by the references in Daniel chapter 11, especially once you get to Daniel chapter, or verse number 36 in chapter 11, where you really switch gears into something that is uniquely associated with the Antichrist, something that doesn't overlap with Antiochus Epiphanes. You start talking about this figure, like in verse number 28, in type. Antiochus Epiphanes, who we were talking about in association with this kingdom here. We start talking about him as the king of the north who set out the example of what it is to make the abomination of desolation. But once you get to verse number 36 in that description, the description switches in Daniel chapter 11 so that it's no longer dealing with a historical figure. Because everything after verse number 36 in Daniel chapter 11 has no antecedent in history. There's nothing in history that matches that. So everything past verse 36 is future. So, you work through that history of the kingdom of the north, kingdom of the south, Daniel chapter 11, till you get to the type of the Antichrist, who is Antiochus Epiphanes. Right? And so that he's introduced, a few things are said about him, a few things are said about the Maccabean time in that segment. But then it says, this stern-faced king will do as he wills. And that's where you break into something that has nothing to do with historical precedent now, but is talking about something completely and utterly future. And so what happens is, Daniel chapter 11, speaking about the king of the north, king of the south, until it gets to the type of the Antichrist. When it gets to the type of the Antichrist, it skips ahead in history and goes right to the fulfillment of the type in the Antichrist. Right? So it's like you're moving along, you get to the example, and then you jump to the real thing. If that makes sense to you. Okay, that's how to take Daniel chapter 11. If you do, Daniel chapter 11 will make sense to you. So the Antichrist is the king of the north. Now, the thing about this that's interesting is the Seleucid Empire, in the time that the Revelation was being written back in 95 AD, that meets the description. It was an empire that once was, now is not, and will be again. Okay? So you will often see interpreters speak about the Roman Empire having to be revived. The Roman Empire redivivus. If you've ever seen those terms used by an interpreter of this passage of Scripture. That's a mistaken notion. Even though the Roman Empire is the roots from which the Antichrist ultimately has sprung, the fact of the matter is, the empire that's revived by Revelation chapter 17, verses 10 and 11, is not the Roman Empire. It's the king of the north. The king of the north is the empire that once was, now is not, and will be again. So what that means is that the Antichrist is a Seleucid Empire type of a guy. If you want to understand where the Antichrist is coming from, you don't look to Italy, you don't look to France, you don't look to England, you don't look to Israel, you don't look to Egypt, you don't look to anywhere else, you look to the realm of the king of the north. All right, now where was that realm? Well, let's go back to the map. All right, here's the map. If you look at this area, right here is Iraq. Right? This is Syria. This is Lebanon. This is Turkey. All right? So where are you going to, would you expect, if you're interpreting the Bible with any kind of sensibility, it seems to me, if you're interpreting the Bible with any kind of sensibility, understanding that it's meaning to tell you very direct things in very simple and plain language for the most part, where would you look for the Antichrist to come from? You would look for the Antichrist to come from Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, or Turkey. That's it. That's where you would look. That's why Saddam Hussein was interesting until he got bumped off. That's why Bashir Assad was interesting until he demonstrated that he doesn't have anything on the ball. Right? Lebanon is such a mess, who knows whatever is going to come out of there. But that's why Turkey really comes up front and center. And here's an interesting thing. Now, this is just a little bit of a side, because I've had people object to this particular interpretation that I have before, and they say to me things like, well, the Seleucid Empire, that was Syria, it wasn't really Turkey. And well, you can see quite a bit of it is in Turkey, number one. And number two, that little place there, Antioch, the capital of the Seleucid realm, guess where that is today? It's in Turkey. Turkey's boundary is going along Syria, and then it just does a little jut, goes down around, just a little thing like that, just to encompass Antioch. Which, to me, that's a very interesting thing. Very interesting thing. So, that's the that's the Seleucid realm. That's where we look for the Antichrist. Because of where our boundaries are in this day and age, what does that mean? That those are the countries that we're looking for. And, you see 4 candidates there. You know what's really interesting about it, and we'll get to this down here a little bit later on in the next couple lines here. What's really interesting about that, remember the description that we had about the Antichrist in Daniel chapter 7 is that he uproots 3 horns. There's 10 horns, and the little horn, the Antichrist, 3 horns are uprooted before him. And so that's why you always have this 10-7 thing working. Like when you get to the whore of Babylon and she's sitting on a dragon and there's 7 crowns and 10 crowns and 7 heads and 10 crowns. Just all this combination of 10 and 7 and 10 and 7. What's that all about? It's about this reality is that there's 10 nations, 3 of which get more or less co-opted by the Antichrist. The Antichrist is one of the 10. He co-opts these other 3, and so that's why you have 7, 10. Right? There's seven that remain kings, if you will, out of what was originally 10. Are you with me? Is that making sense? All right. So that's how that's working, and I say all that. What's 1 plus 3? 4. There's 4 nations. This is very likely the 1 plus 3 horns ripped out. That's very likely the identification. I can't say it is exactly, or that it's without fail this way, but I think that it's likely. Okay. The 10 horns. He's from the 10 horns. We see that in Daniel chapter 7 and Revelation chapter 17. The 10 horns. Oh, do we have the map? Let's see. Ah, we do. There it is. The 10 horns, again, you see a lot of interpreters, they go up this way, right? They go up this way, up into Europe, because they're stuck in the 4th kingdom. They're stuck seeing everything through a Roman lens. And the thing about a Roman lens is that it's good, but you've got to remember that the Roman Empire went not only up into there, it went the whole way down around here and the whole way up to there. So what you're looking for is not what would be Roman and Roman alone, but you're looking for what is both Roman and Greek. That's the key. It's where those overlap. Why do we know that? We have the little horn in Daniel chapter 7. That's a Roman perspective. We have the little horn in Daniel chapter 8. That's a Greek perspective. Among other things, one of those is pointing to Antiochus, Epiphanes as the type. But in some of the language, it seems to me that there's more than just trying to point that out. It's getting to the things that are ultimate. The little horn, we need to see as somebody who is coming from the place where the Greek and the Roman worlds overlap. Right? So if you're looking for 10 horns, don't look for England. Don't look for Belgium. Don't look at The Hague. Don't look at the Common Market. Don't look at the European Union. Don't look at Italy. Don't look at any of those things. Look at the place where the Greek realm and the Roman realm overlap. That gives your realm of general possibilities. Okay? That's where things are going to likely be. And where is that? Well, it's right here. It's where I have here in yellow. And if you count these up, you'll see, right? We got 1, 2, 3. Then we have 4, 5, 6, 7. And where's the rest going to come out? Well, Azerbaijan is a good candidate, mainly because they do have a Roman history there. Pompey went up there, did some serious conquering. And the Azerbaijanis are cousins to the Turks. That's why they get along so well and they work together so well. They're really from the same tribe. Right? And so that is a good candidate, not because of its necessarily Greek connection, but certainly because of its Roman connection. And then the other two, you have Cyprus right here. The thing about Cyprus is that Cyprus was mostly independent through most of the time. It was heavily influenced by the empires that were around it. So even if it was not directly controlled, it was certainly a vassal, if you will. And right now, it's in the midst where it's got a division of geography and population, Greek and Turkish. There's a settled kind of ceasefire there, peace there. But who knows how long that might be. That's a good candidate. And then, Greece or Saudi Arabia. That's where the 10 horns are going to come from. That's where it's going to develop. That's where it's going to be. It's not going to be in Spain. It's not going to be in France. It's not going to be in England. It's not going to be in any of those places. Certainly not going to be in Germany. That is, there we go, get back here. That is the 10 horns. 10 horns means 10 kings, 10 governmental powers. Maybe is a more modern way to look at that. The horns, that's what the horn symbolizes. And then he has an empire of his own. This is what we were talking about, that little situation at Daniel chapter 7 where it talks about those 3 horns being ripped out for the little horn. What it means is that the Antichrist is not going to be just one of 10 in this confederation. He's going to be one of them, but he's also going to be a guy who has as his personal domain 3 others. Okay? So his horn plus 3 more, that's his personal domain, if you will. Okay. What else can we learn about the Antichrist, right? Here we go. He's a nominal Muslim. Now this you got to stretch across the river with me on. This is not something that I would, bet the farm on. But I think it's a pretty good conclusion. I'll put it that way. So that's my proviso on this. Daniel chapter, there we go. Daniel chapter 11, 37 through 39. Also, Revelation chapter 20, verse 4. There's 2 bits of information in those passages of Scripture that point me into the direction of a nominal Muslim. The passage in Daniel actually tells me 2 things. It says, number 1, that the God that the Antichrist honors is a God of fortresses, or a God of military exploits. It's a weird thing. If you look at that in different English translations, you'll get all kinds of different translations being made of the description that's there in the Hebrew. It's because it's really kind of difficult to understand. I mean, a God of fortresses, what is that? What does that mean? A God of military fortifications? How do you conceive that? It's a bit tough. But that particular passage, and then it goes on to say that in the very next verse, that this God was unknown to, at the time of Daniel's writing, this is a God that's unknown to his fathers. Now, some people say, well, doesn't that mean the time of the Antichrist fathers? No, I think it means at the time of Daniel's writing. And so those combination of 2 things. I'm looking for a God unknown in Daniel's time. And I'm looking at a God who's militaristic. And boing, look at a little bit of history, and out pops something that just makes perfect sense, right? That's Allah. Allah did not, Allah was a concept amongst the Arab tribes, but was not a monotheistic God until Muhammad came along. And so we're talking about things occurring in 600 AD. And so 600 AD, that's about almost 1,000 years, well, actually pretty close to 1,000 years after Daniel. So that meets the description, right? Has to be a God unknown to Daniel's, unknown to the fathers in Daniel's age, unknown to those who would be the fathers of the Antichrist. At this point in time, the Turks were living up north of the Caspian, and so this makes sense. They didn't become Muslim until in the 900s, and they became Muslims when Seljuk we call them the Seljuk Turks, the initial tribes as they moved over into the Middle East. But their first leader, his name actually was Seljuk. That's how they got their name. So they did not adopt Islam until the 900s. So they originally were up in the steppes, the Pontic steppes, as a horse shepherding tribe, and had no conception of Allah. So it makes sense on that particular aim, unknown in Daniel's time. And the sieges, I gave you a couple of references here. Now, if you don't know what these are, surahs are basically chapters in the Quran. And so when you see something and it's referenced by surah with a couple of numbers, what that means is surah 2, basically verse 190. And so in that particular location, and then in surah 193, and also, or surah 2, 193, and then also surah 9, verse 5, you have very good statements right out of the Quran explaining how basically through Muhammad, Allah gives instructions for warfare to the Muslims. And what those passages demonstrate is that Allah is in fact a God who is into war plans, into sieges, into combat warfare's terms of surrender, all of those kinds of things. The Quran has a whole lot more instructions for warfare than you would probably expect in a holy book. But right there is an example of those. That's why EG is there. It's, for example, it doesn't give you everything you can possibly find in the Quran, but I think those really do a good job of kind of setting the description. So, what do we have? We have a militaristic god of sieges unknown in Daniel's time. Who is that? It seems to me like it's Allah. So, what does that mean about the Antichrist? The Antichrist is going to be a nominal Muslim. Why nominal? Well, even though it does tell us in Daniel chapter 11 that he will honor this God, it says that ultimately, and it's almost like speaking out of both sides of the mouth at the same time, it says that he doesn't really give any care at all toward any god, but himself he exalts above all gods. And that's what Antiochus Epiphanes did, believe it or not. Even though he put an idol of Zeus in the temple as his type of the abomination of desolation, Antiochus Epiphanes actually thought that he was God manifested on the earth. The kings of his, or the coins of his realm, actually called him Antiochus Epiphanes, and the Epiphanes in there, Antiochus 4, Epiphanes, the Epiphanes mean the manifested one. So Antiochus fulfilled that in type, and the Antichrist will fulfill that ultimately. He will be somebody who sees himself as God. And, I mean, even in our day and age, we have people that have those kinds of thoughts, right? I mean, it's not even, it seems like that would be something you could only get away with when there was a bunch of superstitions and everything else, ruling the culture that people were in. But even in our, highfalutin modern day and age, we still have people coming forward and trying to, claim that somehow or another they are, some God or some emanation of God or some, connection that makes them God in this place. And so that's what the Antichrist will do as well. And then out of Revelation chapter 20, verse 4, we learn this, that the Antichrist has a predilection for beheading. Who else has a predilection for beheading? Allah. ISIS does. But I mean, what is that coming from? It's coming from the Quranic teaching that is the appropriate punishment for an infidel. So, what does that tell me? Again, that's a little tenuous. I understand that. So if you're looking at it and saying, "Yeah, Pastor, that's not a very good case," okay, I'll admit. It's not locked down. It's not, it's not no arguments. But I think it's not a bad analysis. So anyhow, we move on to the next thing. He's going to be a militaristic adventurer. these passages here, Daniel chapter 11, now that gives you everything after verse number 39, because that's explaining things that have to do with the Antichrist, full of military adventures, and then the Olivet Discourse, the whole wars and rumors of wars, and then leading into Jerusalem being surrounded, and then of course in Revelation chapter 13, verse number 4, one of the things that I think is part of the delusion that we haven't talked about yet, but we will, is that the people of the world, when they see this Antichrist, when they look upon him, their thoughts are going to be, who can make war against him? That's what's in their mind. When they look on him, they're going to see him as someone so strong and so able militaristically that they just in their minds can't even conceive what purpose, benefit, or what end would come about by opposing him, by making war on him. Who can make war against him? And so I think all of this goes into this description. He's a militaristic adventurer. He is the one who sets up the abomination of desolation. Here's the descriptions of those. Daniel chapter 9, verse number 27. It's shown in Antiochus Epiphanes, here in 11:31 in Daniel. And then, of course, it talks about this in Revelation chapter 13, verses 14 and 15. In that particular place, it tells us the false prophet is the one who actually has the hands-on work that he's doing for the Antichrist to set up this image, this abomination. But, that's where it is. We told you all about Antiochus already. The Antichrist is going to have an image of himself. If you recall, when we just glanced past Daniel chapter 3 in the earlier days of this particular study, one of the things I said there is, I actually believe that Nebuchadnezzar's statue probably was his own image. Nothing in the Bible tells me that, other than the fact that Nebuchadnezzar in some respect also is a type, a model for this particular figure. And if the Antichrist is going to do it at the end of time, I don't doubt that Nebuchadnezzar set the pattern back in his day. But that's the abomination of desolation. Do we know exactly what it is? Yes, we do, because it's described fairly clearly in Revelation chapter 13. It's not going to involve sacrificing a pig on the altar or anything else like that. It's going to be this idol set up in the temple. Okay, so then we go on. What else do we know about him? He is a megalomaniac. We know that because he thinks of himself as above all gods. He in his own mind is it, right? And so he's full of himself to the max. And this is really, I think, demonstrated in the whole thing of the mark. Now, the mark, a lot of discussion has come up about the mark over the last year with COVID and the vaccines and all that. There's quite a few people who think that COVID vaccines might be related to the mark. And I've told you before, that's just absolutely not true. It's not so. The mark is something that is going to be on the wrist or the forehead. It's going to be something that is clearly seen to have the number of the Antichrist name. Remember, we were talking about 666 last week. That's going to be part of that mark. And here's the thing, is that mark is associated very clearly in Revelation chapter 13 with the worship of the Antichrist. So somebody who is a good God-fearing Christian, loves God, and goes down to CVS and gets a vaccine for COVID is not bowing down to the Antichrist, not consciously worshiping him, not setting themselves up for participating in the worldwide economic program that's going to be enforced then. So, does the mark have anything to do with a COVID vaccine? No, not even close. It's almost ridiculous to think that way, but there's just so much fear and misinformation and all that goes along with it. We're living in a day and age where the devil is very active. And what the devil is very active doing more than anything else, it seems to me, is trying to produce fear. When you see a bunch of fear being foisted, back in the days of of Watergate, he said, follow the money, right? If you think about the devil, think about fear. That's like his stock in trade. So where people are given heebie-jeebies and put into frightful sleepless nights over, oh no, what's going to happen? I can tell you, there's something that the devil is afoot in all of that. We're not about fear. We're about faith. Right? We know who died for us. We know who's washed us clean in the sight of God. And we know that what he's done for us, there's no devil in hell can take away from us. Right? So what do we have to fear? Nothing. So get on with life. Get on with living life. You don't have anything to fear about those things. If it makes sense to you to get the vaccine, by all means get the vaccine. If it doesn't make sense to you, get the vaccine because you have other reasons than it being the mark, then by all means don't get the vaccine. As I've said before, I don't care if you get it or you don't get it. I'm going to love you one way or the other. But please just, don't get involved with the fear that it's the mark. It's not even close. We're not going to see the mark until we're midway into the tribulation period anyhow.
Setting it up, though, because it says you can't buy or sell in some of these countries.
The psychology of it is being tested, it seems to me. I think that's probably true, is that what we're seeing is, it's like beta testing, right? The market is being tested. The idea is being tested in a broad population. I think we're on the verge of the end of time. I think that at any given moment, the sky's going to open up and Jesus is going to be getting us. And I think that all that we're seeing plays very clearly into that kind of an understanding, that kind of interpretation. And it only makes sense that we would go through some kind of an event at this time in the world that would more or less grease the wheels. But that still doesn't mean that it's wrong to take the vaccine, right? What do we have to worry about what the devil might be trying to work down the pike when we won't even be here? That's not our concern. We don't have to worry about that. I once had a preacher. He was older and wiser, when I was first getting into ministry. And somehow or another, the discussion came up when we were having a little pastor's get-together. And someone had brought up how evil it was that the lottery was getting played by so many people, and gambling was just, old-time Pentecostals, right? We don't gamble. We don't drink. We don't smoke. And so one guy said, if someone came and tried to give me a tithe of those winnings, I'd turn it down. And I remember this guy says, I don't know about that. He says, I'd take the devil's money any day and use it for good. And I think, he's the same guy who told me that when he was building his church, this guy was full of great expressions, right? He was asked how he was financing it, and he said he went out and took out the biggest old mortgage he could. And they said, well, my goodness, aren't you worried about debt and bondage? He says, no, he says, I figure we'll go up in the rapture and leave it to the Antichrist. So, you gotta love some of those old characters in the ministry. But anyhow, he's a megalomaniac. The mark is it's all about worshiping him. See, and so what the mark does is all the people that take the mark, and this is why it's seen as such a deal breaker as far as being saved and all that kind of stuff. Because to take the mark, what must you do? You must acknowledge the Antichrist as God. Right? I mean, that is part and parcel of what is happening there from the description in chapter 13 of Revelation. So, what does that tell you about the Antichrist? I mean, if he is the epitome, no one who's ever existed has ever been more full of themselves than this person will be. And now I'm throwing my thing on the ground. So, that's the megalomania of the Antichrist. And then we go on here. This last characteristic of the Antichrist. Oh, I'm doing really well. I'm going to get brownie points tonight. or at least not an invitation to sleep in the doghouse. The spiritual capital of his realm is Bergama, Turkey. Now I think, let's see, I have a map. Bergama is the current name, the modern name, for what used to be Pergamum. And so if you go into Revelation and you're reading the letter to the church of Pergamum, two things are stated in that letter that are important in this regard. Number one, it's where the throne of Satan is, and it's where Satan lives. Both of those things are said explicitly in that letter to the church of Pergamum. Now, there has been a lot of interpretations of those things. We talked a little bit about, people look at that archaeological site that I think is in the Berlin Museum now. It's, just basically a couple of pillars and a stairway up, and it looks something like a throne. That's the throne of Satan. No, it's not. Now, the throne of Satan is talking about the place from which his power basically goes out. The spot from which he rules. And it tells us very clearly in that letter that it's Pergamum. Not only is that the place where his throne is, but it's where he lives. So I don't know what it is about that place. Someone asked me, is there something cosmic going on there? I had no idea. We're not told that. I'd have to speculate. I'll speculate when there's something that I can, jump off of. But there's nothing in the Bible anywhere. I can't find anything in the descriptions of anything in the Scriptures that give me any insight into that at all. All I know is that it's named very specifically. And so when it comes down the pike, now remember, the letters to the churches are not about church ages. And the biggest thing why you know that, if you recall what I said, is why do we know that? For the most part, it's not just the number 7. It's because they're not ordinal. They're not put in order. They're not sequential. They're just named without regard to first, second, third, fourth. So there's nothing that puts them into sequence. So what is the basis, or what's the point of those 7 letters? What's the 7 mean? Is that these letters are meant to be God's expression to the totality of the church at any given time. At any given time, churches are going to be represented by those 7 models, those 7 types, at any given time. One of those given times is going to be at the end of time. And at the end of time, where do we expect Satan to be? Camping out, making mischief. Right there. Right there. Now right there's Istanbul, that's Constantinople, and it's not on the map, but right over about here, if it was on the map, would be Ankara, the capital of Turkey. And then right, if you go down to about here, that would be Antioch. So just so, those places are related to you in some respect or another. But that is the place that will be the spiritual capital of the realm of the Antichrist. Now, why do we know that? Well, when we go to Revelation chapter 12 and 13, what we see there very clearly is that the devil has a very close, very intimate relationship, connection with the Antichrist. The dragon, as he is shown in that particular spot, is the one who has basically brought up the beast and given the beast its power. So the Antichrist is all about what the devil is doing in the earth. So, again, I asked that question last week. If that's the case, and it most definitely is, now I can say that very specifically from the Scripture. If that's the case, then where would you expect the Antichrist to be? Would he be in Washington, D.C.? Would he be in Tokyo, Japan? Would he be in Beijing? Would he be in Seoul, South Korea? No, he's going to be someplace, within reach. It seems to me of Bergama, Turkey, and again, that just kind of draws that bullseye, does it not? Right on Turkey. Turkey is what I'm watching. Turkey is what it seems to me to everything kind of zeroes in on in our day and age. It's where Antioch is, interestingly enough. It's where the king of the north was, interestingly enough. It's where Bergama is, interestingly enough. It's like all the various little things that the Bible gives us clues about. Right, they all align in Turkey. So Turkey is ground zero, it seems to me. It could be that Syria or Lebanon, even Iraq, might be able to produce this figure that we're looking for, but everything really does point to Turkey.